first is to describe just theology, which is written in public language for a public audience, and I'll do that simply by describing some of the things which I'm doing in my writing. So it's based very much on my own experience. Public theology is theology which is addressed to an audience which is not necessarily Christian or Catholic or whatever group that you're coming from. Public theology addresses an audience which is notionally, at any rate, a secular audience, and so therefore you need to find a language which does address that audience. Public audience, particularly within Eureka Street, which is where I find this task is perhaps most demanding, that it's written for an audience which is notionally non-Christian. Eureka Street is a public magazine, so it's written precisely for that audience, at least notionally secular audience, although many of the readers may well be Catholic or Christian or whatever. And so therefore anything that's written in it has to be coming from that particular perspective. And so in writing for Eureka Street, if I'm writing on church issues or theological issues, then I need to explain them within a public language and not in a way that's simply adherents of particular denomination or particular faith would understand. And I don't want to be academic in the sense of require a language in advance for people to understand it, whether it be sociological or psychological or theological or whatever. For Eureka Street, of course, is not just theological, it has articles on many topics, and you'd also be expecting people in those areas not to be writing out of their in-language for the group that they belong to, whether it be economists or doctors or whatever, but for a public language. I think in terms of imagery, it's less a matter of technique. I think perhaps it's initially a matter of visualising an audience and finding a voice for it. And it's a bit more, I suppose it is technique, but it's a bit more mysterious, I find, than planned technique. It's something you find yourself doing things without really realising what you're doing or why you're doing it, but you do sense this works and that doesn't. But what I'm interested in doing in writing is to create a public conversation, a space for public conversation. What we're about is reasoned conversation, and conversation is a word I prefer to use rather than the more popular debate, perhaps, to describe the public world as a debate. It tends to invite polemic and rather abusive argument, which sometimes seems to be the object of the exercise, whereas a conversation is about it's taking reasoned positions, and that seems to me to be it's the core of any worthwhile writing, that you do engage other people and they reflect on the issue and where they're coming from, you reflect on the issue and where you're coming from, and maybe in that exchange, and hopefully in that exchange, you'll have new insights and perhaps even change your mind. It's only useful perhaps if you reflect a bit on translation, that any kind of translation has problems. It's never straight. That when you've translated, say, when you've translated something from one language into another, there's always a sediment left behind. I guess in the simplest form you're trying to present an account of Christian life or Christian belief, in terms that will be intelligible and enlightening for a public audience. So there's an element of translation in that, as you would translate the Bible, say, into English. So you would do that. But translation itself, though, is something that's very mysterious, and that's the other reason why it's a good term to start with, because in a translation you never translate something without remainder. There's always connotations and elements of what is in an original language which you can't reproduce and don't reproduce within the translation. So there's something left out of the translation. But also in any translation you're in fact introducing something into the into the new form of what you're conveying that wasn't there originally. So translation is really, there's something very mysterious about it. So that's why I thought translation is a good starting point. But in fact, I think when you are moving into the public language, if you are really to get things across, you need something more than translation. There needs to be some form of transformation that takes place so that people will recognise almost with a shock that they have discovered something new about the practice or the aspect of faith you're talking about, but they'll also recognise something new in the secular world because of the analogies that you've been using. If I find that when my writing works and when there's feedback that it works, because that's the test, isn't it? It's usually because there's a striking image or striking metaphor somewhere at the heart of what I'm saying. What is it that when I'm writing well, what is happening? That's the question I begin with here, so it's a personal question rather than a more general one. But I find that usually for me is a question, it's a case of having found a strong and a striking image, usually taken from contemporary culture or contemporary life, and then and in relating that then to the world of faith or of church life, then something, there is illumination which happens both ways, as I was saying before. When it does work, those images do work, what seems to happen is that people see new possibilities, not simply in this Christian message, in faith, but they also see new possibilities in the within the world itself. Yes, I think if I was criticised for being evangelical in that sense of out to make converts of the people to whom I'm talking, I think I'm much more subversive actually than people would give me credit for, because what I'm really interested in doing is to sow seeds in people's minds, and those seeds may grow, they will grow as they grow. As I understand it, God will be in the growth, but they'll grow in quite unpredictable ways. And that seems to be a much more dangerous operation than giving a message to someone.